Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. Story 1. The Silent Gazes. It all started with the house on Willow Lane. Every town has one of those houses, the kind that parents warn their children to stay away from, the kind that lingers in your peripheral vision even when you're trying your best to ignore it. But this house was different. It wasn't just the peeling paint, the gnarled trees that seemed to claw at the windows, or the way the grass refused to grow in the yard. No, it was something more sinister, something that made your skin crawl every time you walked past. Every time I passed by, there were people in the windows, different families, each more unnerving than the last. It started on a cold autumn evening as I was coming back from the corner store. The sky was a bruised purple, and the wind whispered through the trees. I should have known better than to look, but there's something about that house that compels you, like a voice just behind your ear, urging you to glance over. And when I did, I saw them. A family, mother, father, 2 children, standing in the front window, staring out at me. Their eyes were wide and hollow, their faces a sickly shade of gray, but what struck me most was the silence. No sound came from the house, not a whisper, not a creak, just a stillness that seemed to stretch out into eternity. The family didn't move, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge that they were being watched. I hurried past, telling myself that I had imagined it, that it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The way their eyes had followed me, the way they seemed trapped behind the glass. Sleep didn't come easy that night, and when it finally did, it was filled with nightmares of that house and the silent figures within. The next day, I walked past the house again, and this time, a different family stood in the window. They looked older, dressed in clothes from a bygone era, perhaps the 1920s. The father wore a tweed suit, the mother a long dress with a high collar, and the children were dressed in matching sailor outfits. Their eyes, too, were fixed on me, lifeless yet intense, as if they were silently pleading for something. I couldn't look away, even as my heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't normal. This wasn't possible. Over the next few days, I found myself making excuses to walk past the house more often, each time finding a new family in the windows. Some were modern, others from distant decades, but all shared the same haunting expression, eyes wide, lips pressed together in an eternal silence. They never moved, never changed positions, just stood there, staring out as if waiting for something. Or someone. It wasn't long before I started asking around the neighborhood about the house. Most people brushed me off, dismissing it as just another old, creepy building. But there were a few, older folks mostly, who gave me strange looks when I mentioned it. They warned me to stay away, said the house was cursed, that it had a way of latching onto people, dragging them into its dark history. But no one could, or would, tell me what that history was. The more I pressed, the more they withdrew, leaving me with nothing but my growing obsession. I knew I should have let it go, should have stayed away like everyone else. But something about those silent families called to me, pulled me in deeper every day. And I couldn't help but wonder, what would happen if I went inside? Would I find the families still standing there, or would the truth be something far worse? Whatever it was, I was determined to find out. I just needed to gather the courage to face whatever horrors lurked within. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. I spent the next few days working up the nerve to approach the house. My curiosity had evolved into something darker, an obsession that gnawed at me, urging me to uncover the mystery behind those ghostly figures. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that what I was seeing couldn't possibly be real. But no matter how hard I tried, the house on Willow Lane kept pulling me back, its silent occupants haunting my every thought. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, I found myself standing at the foot of the cracked, overgrown pathway leading to the front door. The house loomed above me, its windows dark and empty. For the first time in days, I didn't see a family in the window, but that only made the place feel more sinister. The absence of those figures left a void, a hollow dread that tightened my chest. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the rusted doorknob. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave and never return, but I was too far gone. The need to understand, to confront whatever was inside, had consumed me. With a deep breath, I pushed open the door, its creak echoing through the stillness like a mournful sigh. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay, a damp, musty odor that clung to my skin. The foyer was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the setting sun filtering through the grimy windows. Dust motes danced in the air, and the floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, revealing patches of mold underneath. A staircase spiraled up into the shadows, leading to the second floor where I had seen the families. I stood there for a moment, my breath shallow, trying to gather my courage. As I took my first step up the staircase, a cold breeze brushed against the back of my neck, sending a shiver down my spine. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the foyer was empty. I shook off the feeling and continued upwards, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was unnervingly quiet, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When I reached the top of the stairs, I was met with a long, narrow hallway lined with closed doors. The silence was oppressive, the kind that makes your ears ring as they strain to catch the slightest sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the first door. With a trembling hand, I turned the knob and pushed it open, revealing a small, dimly lit bedroom. It was empty, save for a dusty, four-poster bed and an old wardrobe. But something felt off. There was a strange energy in the room, a lingering presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I backed out of the room and moved on to the next door, my anxiety mounting with each step. The second room was similar to the first, furnished, but devoid of life. As I continued down the hall, a sense of dread grew within me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from the shadows. I reached the last door at the end of the hallway, my hand trembling as I grasped the knob. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a large, darkened room. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized that this was the room I had seen from the street, the one with the front window where the families had appeared. But the room was empty, save for a single, ancient mirror propped up against the far wall. Its surface was cracked, the glass warped and clouded with age. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat as I caught sight of something moving within the reflection. It was faint at first, just a ripple across the glass, but then the shapes began to take form, faces, twisted in agony, pressed against the inside of the mirror, their mouths open in silent screams. My blood ran cold as I realized that these were the families I had seen, trapped within the mirror's surface, their eyes pleading for release. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the mirror began to hum, a low, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. And then, with a deafening crack, the mirror shattered, sending shards of glass flying across the room. But instead of relief, a wave of terror washed over me as I realized that the figures were no longer in the mirror, they were behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The room was empty, at least, it appeared to be at first. But the air felt heavier, thick with the presence of something unseen, something malevolent. The broken shards of the mirror lay scattered across the floor, reflecting my own terrified expression back at me in 1,000 tiny pieces. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just seen, but the rational part of me was quickly losing ground to pure, unfiltered fear. Just as I was about to flee, a voice, soft and barely audible, whispered my name from the shadows. It was a voice I didn't recognize, yet it felt oddly familiar, like a long-forgotten memory surfacing from the depths of my mind. "You shouldn't have come," it said, the words laced with a sorrow that made my heart ache. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath clouding in the air in front of me. "Who's there?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The room remained silent, but the oppressive feeling of being watched only intensified. I backed towards the door, my hand fumbling for the doorknob, desperate to escape the suffocating presence that surrounded me. But as I turned, I saw them, standing in the doorway, blocking my only exit. It was the first family I had seen from the street, the one with the hollow eyes and gray skin. They were no longer staring out at me from behind the glass, but were standing there in the flesh, or what remained of it. Their eyes were still wide and unblinking, their expressions frozen in a grotesque mask of fear. The mother reached out to me with a skeletal hand, her fingers clawing at the air as if she were trying to grasp something just out of reach. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Help us." I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs. "What happened to you?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The mother opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the father stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "We were trapped," he said, his voice a hollow echo. "This house, it's not what it seems. It feeds on us, on our fear, our pain. We've been here for so long, so long." His eyes, once empty, now brimmed with despair. "It's the mirror. It's a doorway, a trap. And now, it has you too." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The mirror, the families trapped inside, their faces twisted in agony. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was too horrifying to fully comprehend. "How do I get out?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "How do I stop this?" The children, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward, their small hands clasped together. "You have to find the key," the boy said, his voice soft yet clear. "It's the only way to close the doorway, to break the curse. The key is hidden where it all began." "Where it all began?" I echoed, confusion and fear warring within me. "What does that mean? Where do I find it?" Before they could answer, the air in the room shifted, the shadows deepening, coiling around the family like tendrils of darkness. Their forms began to waver, dissolving into the gloom. "The cellar," the mother whispered, her voice fading as the darkness swallowed her. "Find the cellar, and hurry, before it's too late." And then they were gone, leaving me alone in the room with nothing but the shattered remains of the mirror and the weight of their words hanging over me. The cellar. Whatever this house was, whatever malevolent force had taken hold here, the answer, my only chance of escape, lay below. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. The house had secrets, dark and terrible, and if I was going to survive, I would have to uncover them. But as I turned to leave the room, I heard it again, the voice, whispering my name. And this time, it was coming from the cellar. The descent into the cellar felt like a journey into another world, one where light and hope had no place. I found the entrance hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the kitchen, the kind you'd miss unless you knew exactly where to look. The stairs creaked under my weight as I made my way down, each step plunging me deeper into a darkness so thick it felt alive, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The air was damp and cold, carrying the scent of earth and something else, something rotten. As I reached the bottom, I fumbled for the flashlight I had brought with me. Its weak beam cut through the gloom, revealing a low-ceilinged chamber lined with rough stone walls. The cellar was cluttered with forgotten relics, rusted tools, cracked jars, and decaying furniture that seemed to dissolve into the shadows. But the thing that caught my attention immediately was the door. It was ancient, made of heavy, warped wood, with iron hinges that looked like they hadn't been touched in centuries. There was no doubt in my mind, this was where I would find the key. But as I approached the door, something in the darkness moved. My flashlight flickered, and I whipped around, the beam dancing across the walls. For a moment, I thought I saw faces, those same hollow eyes staring at me from the shadows, but when I blinked, they were gone. The door before me seemed to pulse, as if it were breathing, waiting for me to cross the threshold. I reached out, my hand trembling as I gripped the cold iron handle, and with a deep breath, I pulled it open. Inside, the room was different from the rest of the cellar. It was cleaner, almost pristine, as if time hadn't touched it. A single object dominated the space, a massive iron chest, covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. The key, I knew instinctively, was inside. I stepped forward, the air around me growing colder with each step. My breath fogged in the light of the flashlight as I knelt before the chest. My hands shook as I reached out to touch the lid. The moment my fingers made contact, a shock of cold surged through me, freezing my blood in my veins. I yanked my hand back, gasping for breath as a wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't just an ordinary chest, it was something else, something alive, imbued with the same dark energy that haunted this house. Summoning what little courage I had left, I forced myself to open the chest. The lid groaned, the symbols flaring to life as they resisted my efforts, but finally, with one last push, it gave way. Inside, nestled in a bed of black velvet, was an ancient iron key, its surface etched with the same symbols as the chest. I reached for it, and as soon as my fingers closed around the cold metal, the room shuddered violently. The shadows that had been lurking at the edges of the room surged forward, swirling around me like a maelstrom. Voices echoed through the darkness, whispers of anger and despair. The families, the ones trapped in the mirror, they were here with me, their tortured souls bound to this place. The ground trembled beneath me, and I realized with growing horror that the house itself was waking up, angry that I had found its secret, desperate to keep me from escaping. I stumbled back, clutching the key to my chest as the cellar began to collapse around me. Stones fell from the ceiling, the walls cracking and buckling as the house groaned in fury. I had to get out. I had to seal the doorway before it was too late. But the shadows, those terrible, grasping shadows, were closing in, reaching out with long, tendril-like fingers, ready to pull me down into the darkness with them. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and ran, racing up the stairs as the cellar crumbled behind me. The house shook violently, the walls warping and twisting as if the building itself was trying to consume me. I reached the kitchen, the key slick with sweat in my hand, and made a beeline for the front door. But just as I reached it, the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The voices were louder now, filling my head with their anguished cries. They wanted the key. They needed it. I could feel their desperation clawing at me, trying to tear it from my grasp. The house buckled again, and I knew I had only seconds left before it was too late. With a final, desperate cry, I drove the key into the floorboards, right into the center of the symbols etched there. For a moment, everything went silent. The house seemed to hold its breath, the shadows freezing in place. Then, with a deafening roar, the house collapsed inward, the walls folding in on themselves as a blinding light filled the space. I felt myself being pulled, yanked away from the collapsing building, and everything went dark. When I woke, I was lying in the middle of Willow Lane, the house gone, nothing but a pile of rubble left where it had stood. I could hear sirens in the distance, people shouting, but it all seemed so far away. The key was still in my hand, its metal warm now, almost pulsing with a strange, faint energy. I knew the danger wasn't over, that whatever force had created the house, had trapped those souls, was still out there, still waiting. But for now, I was alive. And the house, at least, was gone. Or so I thought, until I looked down at the key again and saw the faint reflection of a family staring back at me from its polished surface. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The House of the Laughing Walls. They say old houses have memories, but this one, hidden in the dense woods of northern Maine, seemed to harbor something more, something twisted and alive. I inherited the place from an uncle I barely knew, a recluse who vanished without a trace years ago. The letter came suddenly, an offer from a distant lawyer, so out of the blue that I nearly dismissed it as a scam. But the address was real, and curiosity, or perhaps something darker, pulled me to that remote location. The promise of isolation was appealing, the idea of writing my novel in solitude almost too good to be true. The house was a Victorian relic, its wooden facade graying like a corpse left too long in the sun. Overgrown ivy snaked up the sides, and the windows, clouded with grime, looked like blind eyes. Despite its decay, the structure had a certain gravitas, as if it was waiting for something, or someone. I dismissed the unease in my gut as nothing more than nerves. After all, the house was mine now, a fresh start away from the city's noise and clamor. The inside was just as expected, dust thick enough to carve initials into, and the stale air of a place long abandoned. But it was also charming in its own way, full of old-world details that spoke of better times. Ornate wooden moldings, faded but elegant wallpaper, and a grand staircase that creaked with every step. I imagined the stories that might have unfolded here, love affairs, arguments, perhaps even a ghost or two if I let my imagination run wild. I laughed at the thought, more amused than frightened. I was a man of reason. After all, ghosts were just stories, and this house, though eerie, was just that, a house. My first night passed in uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional groan of the house settling. I chalked it up to the wind outside, howling through the trees like a restless spirit. But in the morning, I noticed something odd. The dust in the hallway was disturbed, a faint trail leading from the front door to the staircase, as if someone had been pacing. I convinced myself it was my own doing, my mind playing tricks on me as I explored the house the previous evening. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, a sensation that grew stronger as the day went on. That evening, as I sat in the parlor trying to write, the temperature dropped suddenly. The air grew thick, oppressive, like something heavy was pressing down on my chest. I heard a faint noise, a rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere deep within the house. My laughter, which had been genuine at first, started to feel forced as the sound grew louder, closer. I finally decided to investigate, telling myself it was just a loose shutter or a rodent scurrying in the walls. But as I followed the noise, it led me to a door at the end of a narrow corridor, a door that hadn't been there before. It was old, more ancient than the rest of the house, with deep scratches gouged into the wood as if something had tried to claw its way out. The handle was ice cold to the touch, and when I turned it, the door swung open with a creak that echoed down the hall. The room beyond was dark, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. I fumbled for a light, my hand trembling more than I cared to admit, and when the bulb flickered on, I saw it. The words "help me" scrawled in dark red on the walls. I laughed, at first. It was such a ridiculous sight, straight out of a horror movie, that I couldn't help it. But as I stepped closer, my laughter died in my throat. The words were fresh, the blood still wet. And then, as if in response to my laughter, the walls themselves began to bleed, dark rivulets seeping from the cracks and running down like tears. I backed away, heart pounding, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But when I turned to leave, the door slammed shut on its own, trapping me inside. I was no longer laughing. The darkness in the room seemed to press in on me, thick and suffocating, as if the very air was conspiring to keep me from breathing. I banged on the door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't budge. My hands were slick with sweat, or was it something else? I wiped them on my jeans, feeling the wetness smear, but the sensation didn't go away. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, seeping with that thick, dark fluid. The words "help me" loomed in the dim light, mocking my terror. Then, I heard it, a soft whisper, almost indistinguishable at first, like the rustling of dead leaves. It came from behind me, a voice so faint and ethereal that it could have been just the wind. But as I strained to listen, the whisper grew clearer, the words becoming more distinct. "Help me," it said, the voice trembling with fear. "Please, help me." I spun around, eyes wide, searching for the source. But the room was empty, except for the shadows that clung to the corners like dark stains. The whisper repeated, more insistent this time, as if whoever, or whatever, was speaking was drawing closer. My heart pounded in my chest, a drumbeat of panic that echoed in my ears. The temperature dropped further, my breath misting in front of me, and I knew I was no longer alone. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I held my breath, waiting for a response, but all I heard was the deafening sound of my own heartbeat. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was all in my head, the voice returned, louder now, almost a wail. "Help me, please," it cried, full of anguish. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the house was a living entity, desperate and suffering. I backed up against the door, my mind racing. This wasn't just some prank or figment of my imagination. Something, or someone, was trapped here, and they were calling out to me. In a burst of adrenaline, I rushed to the walls, searching for any sign of what was happening. The blood had stopped flowing, but the words remained, glaring at me in the dim light. I pressed my ear against the cold surface, hoping to hear something that would make sense of this nightmare. Instead, I felt a chill seep into my skin, a cold so deep it made my bones ache. And then I heard the whisper again, but this time it wasn't asking for help. It was laughing, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The laughter grew louder, reverberating through the room, until it felt like it was coming from all around me. I stumbled back, clutching my head as the sound intensified, a cacophony of voices all laughing in unison. It was a mockery, a twisted symphony of madness that threatened to shatter my sanity. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door behind me flew open, slamming against the wall with a force that rattled the whole house. I didn't hesitate. I bolted out of the room, my only thought to get as far away from that nightmare as possible. The laughter followed me, echoing down the hallway as I ran, twisting and turning through the maze of corridors until I burst out into the night air. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the dirt road, the house a distant silhouette against the dark sky. I doubled over, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from what I had just experienced. But as I looked back at the house, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the upstairs window, a faint light flickered, and for just a moment, I saw a figure standing there, watching me. It was a shadowy shape, indistinct but undeniably human, and though I couldn't make out its face, I felt its eyes on me, boring into my soul. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness. I turned and ran again, but this time, I wasn't just fleeing the house, I was fleeing something far more terrifying. Whatever was in that house wasn't just a ghost or a figment of my imagination. It was something ancient, something evil, and it had awakened. I didn't return to the house immediately. I spent the night in my car, parked under a towering pine tree far enough away that I could barely make out the house through the fog. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the window, watching, waiting. The darkness of the woods seemed alive, closing in on me as if the house had sent its shadows out to find me. But nothing emerged from the trees, and by morning, I convinced myself that I had let my imagination run wild. Still, the house loomed large in my thoughts. It felt like it was pulling at me, a silent summons I couldn't ignore. By noon, I gathered the courage to return. The house stood as I had left it, old and decrepit, but now it seemed different, more sinister, as if it had been watching me all night, biding its time. I hesitated at the front door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. When it didn't, I steeled myself and stepped inside. The interior was just as I'd remembered, dusty, silent, but no longer empty. The house felt occupied, as if it was filled with an invisible presence that brushed against my skin, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. I moved cautiously, every creak of the floorboards setting my nerves on edge. The room where I had seen the bleeding walls was just ahead, its door slightly ajar as if inviting me in. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to approach, to confront whatever was inside. But when I pushed the door open, the room was different. The walls were clean, free of any blood or writing. The air was still thick and cold, but there was no sign of the terror from the night before. For a moment, I doubted my own memories. Had it all been a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by stress and isolation? But then I noticed something new, a faint, acrid smell, like burntwood mixed with decay. It hung in the air, growing stronger as I crossed the threshold. I followed the scent to a corner of the room where the wallpaper was peeling. Beneath the tattered paper, the wall was charred, blackened by fire. I tore at the wallpaper, revealing more scorch marks, and something else, tiny symbols etched into the wood, almost like runes. They were intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. As I traced them with my fingers, I felt a shock, like static electricity, jolt up my arm. A sudden noise behind me made me whirl around, but the room was still empty. I backed away from the wall, my mind racing. Those symbols, they were ancient, something out of a history book, and they shouldn't have been there. I had seen similar markings once before, in a text about forbidden rituals, though I had dismissed it as nonsense at the time. Now, faced with the real thing, I felt a deep sense of dread settle in my gut. I decided to leave the room, but as I turned, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. A shadow darted across the hall outside, too fast to be human. I froze, listening, but all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Then the laughter began again, faint and distant, like an echo from the depths of the house. It was the same laughter from before, low and mocking, but this time, it wasn't alone. Another voice joined in, and then another, until the air was filled with the sound of unseen entities reveling in some dark joke. My legs moved before my mind caught up, carrying me out of the room and down the hallway. I had to get out, to leave the house before whatever was in here decided to reveal itself fully. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped. There, at the foot of the staircase, was my uncle. He stood motionless, staring up at me with eyes that were far too wide, far too dark. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. "Uncle?" I whispered, my voice trembling. But he didn't respond. Instead, he slowly raised a hand and pointed back towards the room I had just fled. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice barely more than a rasp. "It's awake now. It knows you're here." I took a step back, shaking my head. What is it? What's happening?" He didn't answer, just turned and started walking away, his form flickering like a bad TV signal. I wanted to follow him, to get answers, but my feet were rooted to the spot. And then, just as he reached the front door, he vanished, leaving behind only the sound of that damnable laughter echoing through the house. I was alone again, or so I thought. But as I stood there, paralyzed with fear, I felt a presence behind me, something cold and malevolent, breathing down my neck. I didn't dare turn around, but I knew, deep down, that it was the same thing that had haunted this house for years. It had waited, dormant, for someone like me to awaken it. And now, it was free. The weight of the presence behind me was suffocating, pressing down like an invisible hand ready to snuff out my life. My mind screamed for me to run, but my legs felt heavy, frozen in place by a terror so profound it seemed to seep into my very bones. The house was alive with the sound of laughter echoing through the walls, each note tinged with malice. It was as if the house itself was laughing at me, mocking my every step, my every breath. Finally, I found the strength to move. I bolted down the stairs, the laughter chasing me, growing louder and more distorted with every step. The front door was so close, just a few feet away, but as I reached out to grab the handle, it vanished, replaced by a solid wall. I stumbled back, disbelief coursing through me as I realized the house had trapped me. There was no escape, no way out. The walls seemed to close in, the hallway stretching impossibly long before my eyes. Desperation clawed at my throat. I turned and ran through the house, frantically searching for another exit. The windows were sealed shut, the glass too thick and sturdy to break. Every door I tried led to another room, each one more twisted and alien than the last, filled with the faint whispers and shadows that seemed to mock my every move. The house was a labyrinth of madness, designed to drive me deeper into its clutches. I reached a door at the end of a narrow corridor, one I hadn't seen before. It was different from the others, newer, less worn, as if it had just been placed there. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed it open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was a single chair, facing away from me. And sitting in that chair was the figure I had seen in the window. The figure was shrouded in darkness, its features indistinguishable, but I could feel its eyes on me. The air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread as I stepped closer, unable to stop myself despite the terror gnawing at my insides. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there, as if waiting for me to make the first move. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figure slowly turned its head towards me, revealing a face that was both familiar and horrifying. It was my own face, twisted and gaunt, eyes sunken and lifeless. The skin was stretched tight over bone, lips curled into a grotesque grin that mirrored the laughter still echoing through the house. It was me, but it wasn't. It was something else, something wearing my face like a mask. "You should never have come here," it said, its voice a raspy imitation of my own. "Now, you can never leave." I staggered back, my mind reeling as the figure stood up, its movements jerky and unnatural. The laughter grew louder, more manic, as the figure took a step towards me. I tried to flee, but my feet wouldn't move, as if the floor itself had grown hands, holding me in place. The figure reached out, its fingers cold as death as they brushed against my skin. The touch was like ice, searing into me, and I knew then that I was lost. In that moment, I understood. The house didn't just want to scare me, it wanted to consume me, to trap me within its walls just as it had done to so many others. My uncle, the voices, the laughter, they were all victims, absorbed into the house's twisted mind, and now I was to become one of them. The figure smiled, its grin stretching impossibly wide as it leaned in close, whispering in my ear. "Welcome home," it hissed. The walls around me began to pulse, the wood groaning as if the house was breathing, alive with malevolent intent. The floor beneath me shifted, and suddenly, I was falling through darkness, through a void that seemed to stretch on forever. The laughter echoed all around me, a cacophony of voices, each one a soul trapped within the house, doomed to an eternity of torment. I landed hard on a cold, damp floor, gasping for breath. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something far worse, something ancient and foul. I pushed myself up, my limbs shaking, and looked around. I was in a basement, a vast, cavernous space that stretched out into the shadows. The walls were lined with the same symbols I had seen upstairs, glowing faintly in the darkness. And then I saw them, figures moving in the shadows, dozens of them, all watching me with hollow, empty eyes. They were the others, the ones who had come before me, all of them lost to the house. Their faces were twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams as they reached out towards me. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nowhere to go. The walls closed in, the figures advancing, their laughter mixing with the cries of the house. And then, from the darkness, the figure from the chair emerged, leading the others. It was still wearing my face, its eyes burning with a malevolent fire. It reached out, and as its cold hand closed around my throat, the last thing I heard was my own laughter joining the chorus. The house had claimed me. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.